to the very first Nuxt Nation conference. I'm Krutie. I'm a senior front-end consultant at Deloitte and a Nuxt ambassador. And today we are going to talk about Nuxt modules. Nuxt modules are a secret superstar of Nuxt because they allow us to customize and extend the default behavior of our Nuxt app. So, to understand all the amazing things Nuxt modules can do for us, let's take a look at the directory structure that I have opened here. Now, these directories can be found in the base Nuxt app, but when we create Nuxt modules, for example, we can add modules inside of modules. We can create a server middleware that is specific to our modules. We can also register custom plugins. Now, we won't have Nuxt config in module as such, but we can certainly provide module options, which can be a set of config variables that can be passed into modules and customize its behavior. Next, we have store. So we can also create Vuex store modules, which can be specific to our Nuxt modules. Also, in our base Nuxt app, we have pages directory, right, which is our file-based routing system. But when we create modules, we can also create custom routes that would work specifically for our modules. These routes and also dynamic routes will have access to the page middleware, including the rest of the lifecycle hooks, such as async data, fetch, validate hook, and so on. And of course, our module can have its own set of components as well. And also with Nuxt modules, we can register custom CSS modules such as Tailwind or Bootstrap Vue. The way I see this is that Nuxt modules allows us to create this tiny little Nuxt app inside of a bigger Nuxt app that is helping us to customize the core functionality of Nuxt. So now that we have a rough idea of what Nuxt modules can do for us, let's learn how we can create one from scratch. And that brings us to the module container class. So any internal or external modules that we use in our Nuxt app, they are all called within the context of this module container, because this module container instance exposes all the right methods for us to, for example, add template, add plugins, add server middleware, add modules, extend routes, and so on. And at the end, we have another powerful feature of Nuxt modules, which are hooks. So hooks are simply the listeners that listen to different Nuxt events. Now, for our regular Nuxt app, we can still use these hooks directly in our Nuxt configuration file, but if we are building a custom modules, we can use these hooks programmatically. For example, if the deployment target of your site is server, then we can utilize these build hooks here. Same way, if we were working with a connect middleware, like the server middleware, we can use the render hooks. And lastly, if we were generating a static site, in that case, we can use any of these generate hooks. So this brings the end of the theoretical aspect of Nuxt modules. You can read more about modules on the Nuxt documentation site, but for now, let's go ahead and create one module from scratch. So moving on to the VS Code, I have created a basic Nuxt app with deployment target static and the rendering mode for SSG. And when we want to introduce modules to our Nuxt app, we will use build modules and the modules key. So currently both of them are empty. So here build modules we use in the dev mode and during the build time. And for all the other modules, we will use our module keys. So we can see that we don't have any module set yet. So let's create one. So modules are processed by the Webpack. So we will be using // to find our module. Let's say the name of our module is sample. And in this sample, we will have module.js. So now at the moment, our sample module doesn't exist. So let's create one folder called modules, where we create another folder for sample, which is the name of our module. And in here, we are going to create module.js. Let's create a basic module, export default function, and here what we get is this, and this will help us access all the Nuxt.js options. So I have created a helper method which will help us see all the keys that we receive in this. So let's save and do yarn dev. So there. Here, as promised, we have Nuxt, we have options, require module, constructor, and here we can see all the methods that we saw earlier, which will help us extend routes, add server middleware, add plugins, add templates, add layout, add arrow layout, and so on. So now that we know what we have available in this, let's use one of the method called extend routes. So let's remove the comment. And here I'm going to write this dot extend routes, which will receive routes as the first argument, and we can use that routes to push new routes. So routes will take 3 detail, name of the route, which I will call items, because I want to render list of items on this route, and the path, which will be items, and here we want to indicate which component we want to render when this route is hit. So under module, of course, we have sample, and I'm going to create a new directory called pages, and under pages I will have items.vue. Right, so let's go ahead and create this route. So under sample, I'm going to create pages, new file called items.vue, and here we'll create a template. So because we are extending routes like here, we can treat this items.vue component as the Nuxt page component, and because of that we should have async data available here. So let's try to fetch some data into our async data. So for this we will use the JSON placeholder, and we will try to fetch few albums, right? So in our async data we can simply make an Axios call and store it in a variable response and create items, because there are so many albums there, but we only want to fetch, say, first 5. So response.data.slice, say give me the first 5, and I'm going to return items. Now we'll also import Axios from Axios, and now we can loop through our items, say 4 item in items. Now we can see that we have ID available here, which is unique across all the records. So let's use item.id as a key. And we will say item.title. Now let's save this file and rerun and check what we have in the browser. So at the localhost 3000 we should have our index.page rendering, which is this component, but because we have extended the routes, we can access items, which according to what we just built, it would print item.title, right? So now I want to be able to click on this link and open a dynamic page where I can see the detail of that album, right? So let's convert this into Nuxt link. And as a link, we will provide items and give me item.id. Right. So now when we click, we should go items/item ID. Right. So let's create a dynamic route in the pages directory of our sample module. So new file _id.vue template script, and again our async call would look very similar, except we will be passing the params.id, right? So async data, and we will destructure params from our Nuxt context, and we will say that slash, only thing is I want to pass in params.id. And I will save this I can destructure it to data and call it payload, because we don't have to slice anything this time. So let's return the payload, and it should be available for us in the template. So it won't work. Reason being, we haven't extended this dynamic route in our module. So let's do that. So now we will copy this and update a little bit. So instead of item, we can go like singular item, and for the path I would extend it to accept the dynamic ID, which we can do using the colon ID. Right? And which component do I want to render? Well, I want to render _ID, right? So just to be safe, let's yarn dev again. And now if we refresh, so Axio is not defined, so let's go to our dynamic route, import Axios from Axios, and refresh again, and we should see it. So now if I go back, click any of the items here, we should be able to see it. Let's quickly try to generate. Right, so I would do yarn generate. Since we are building a static site, we can run yarn generate, and we should be able to see all the static route being generated for this first 5 items that we fetched, and we created 5 dynamic routes for those. There. So we can see that it created 5 routes for us. Now, as a module author, you want to be able to give users an option to customize the name of these routes. So instead of items, I want my users to call their routes anything they like. So let's get on to the module options next. Let's say we want to call our albums products and not items, right? So we will go back to our Nuxt config and provide this path name as a module option. So first we convert our module as an array, and provide path name equals products, right? Now, when we add module options this way, it becomes available for us in our module as the first argument. So when we wrote export default function, here we can access module options, right? So now if we print module options, we should see path name products printing there for us. So div, and here we can see that it printed our path name. Now for extended routes, it's easy for us to update these items to read the path name, right? So let's create /, and we're going to say module option dot path name, right? I'm going to copy it and replace it here. Same way for items ID, we can simply replace it with module options dot path name, and it should be okay. But we have third instance of items right in our items.vue, which is on the client side. So how can we update this item to read our module configuration item path name? Because as we know that modules are run on the server side, and we want to send this specific configuration item on the client side. So to achieve that, we will create a custom plugin and inject that custom plugin into the module. So let's create this .add plugin, which takes src as the key, and in which we are going to provide an absolute path for our plugin. So path.resolve will resolve to an absolute path. So let's just import it. Import path from path. And directory name is the directory where our plugin.js will be. So in our sample module, let's create new file called plugin.js. Now, before we add anything in our plugin.js, there is one thing I forgot, that when we add plugin, in this instance, we need to provide options where we can provide our path name, which will be module options.pathname. Now, if you have been working with Nuxt plugins, you would know that we have an inject method available in a plugin. So we will use inject method to inject our path name so that it's available on the client side on our items.vue. So let's grab this piece of code, go to our plugins.js and paste it there. Now let's comment for now and try to access our options.pathname over here. So let's console.log and options.pathname. So since we have passed our options.pathname in this plugin.js, it should be available somehow, but let's try to console and see if we have anything. So it won't print anything in this instance, because when we pass options to a plugin this way, we must access that options using the EJS notation. So if I add less than % in the end tag, and then if I try to run yarn dev, hopefully it should print it for us. So here we can see that the options.pathname is set to product. So it's working, right? So EJS stands for Embedded JavaScript, and it helps us print server-side variables on our client-side plugin, right? So now we can simply use our inject method and call it path name. So path name will become the name of the variable that we access from our Nuxt context, right? And now we will simply, we don't need the whole console statement, so we will simply add options.pathname. And when we pass options.pathname using EJS, we should add equals just so that it can escape HTML. And now if we go back to our items.vue, where we have Nuxt context available, and as mentioned in the documentation, we can use our injected variable using app.$pathname. So let's return that. I would say path name app.$pathname. And now I would use this path name in the Nuxt link. Right, so let's rerun and access our newly created routes. Tab. Now it's telling us that products is not defined. So the reason for this is that on our plugin.js, it's printing product.pathname and it thinks that it's a variable. So it's really a string for us. So we can add the quotation mark around our EJS and it should be okay. Right, so now we should be able to go to our new routes called products, and also click on the individual detail, and we can see that it's printing products/1. All right, so just as a quick test, let's stop our app, go to config, and let's call it albums. Right, now I do yarn dev. And if we go to albums, we can still access the same items that we printed, and also we can go on our dynamic page with albums/id. And as a one last test, let's try yarn generate to see if we can generate our routes with a custom path name. So here we can see that all of our paths have been generated with a custom path name. Same way, we can provide further module options to say provide a custom API endpoints so that we don't have to fetch the JSON placeholder all the time. Now, before we finish, let's take a look at one more plugin where we inject a Vuex store into our module. So let's go back to our module.js, and I would copy this block. We won't need options in this instance. We will simply create store plugin, and we would go to our sample module and create store plugin.js, and we will begin with export default, where the first argument we get is the Nuxt context, but in this case we only need store, so we will destructure it. And now we are going to tell this plugin that if store exists, create this module. Okay, and once we have our store module defined, we can use register module method, store register module, where I want to call this module, this store module, a simple store, which will be our store module. And let's add some state variable, sample items, 1, 2, 3. Now, let's do yarn dev and inspect our Vue.js dev tool. We can see that our sample store module has already been registered and we can access our sample items in the store state. This brings us to an end of the demo. As you can see that the Nuxt module strategy can be really powerful in organizing your Nuxt app. Now, before we go, I would like to show you an official Nuxt module website. This website has currently 169 modules listed, and seeing the categories here, you can see that we have barely scratched a surface. But I hope this talk has sparked some curiosity for you to explore Nuxt modules in more detail. I am Krutie, and you can find me on krutiepatel.com. There you will find my Twitter, GitHub, Medium, and you can reach out to me if you have any further questions. Thank you.